I can see Martina. Good afternoon, Martina. See Michelle, Linda. Lovely to see you all. Stuart, long time no see. Lovely to see you. Thank you. That's brilliant. Lovely. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. For those of you who I haven't met before, and it's lovely to see those of you I have. I'm Sarah Bates. I'm the chair of the Diversity Project charity, and it's lovely that you could spend this hour with us this afternoon. Just by way of background, the Diversity Project charity was set up initially to replace some of the funding for a number of excellent charities which had previously been supported by the President's Club, as well as to focus on our diversity and inclusion aims. And so far, through the generosity of a number of organisations and individuals, from the founding of the charity in 2018, and including the people who bought digital billboards through Project Mosaic earlier this year, we've raised about £550,000, and we've actually funded 22 charities across the UK, with grants ranging from £3,500 to £50,000. Earlier this year, in response to the pandemic, we actually circulated the charities we'd already funded and provided 9 of those with some emergency core funding to enable them to respond to the pandemic. And by the way, we were really impressed by the changes and the adaptations a number of our charities have brought to this very strange world that we're living in. Today, we're very pleased to present the research that Dr. Louise Ashley has undertaken as a result of a grant we made to the Social Mobility Foundation last year. And we're also welcoming a number of representatives from the organisations with whom Dr. Ashley worked. And we will send you an executive summary of this after the event, so you don't need to take notes just now. This wasn't an easy exercise, and the organisations that have participated should be proud that they've actually opened up to these discussions, and we thank the people who did participate in the interviews too, because it's only by opening this up that we can actually learn and make a difference, and particularly in this time when the crevices and chasms caused by social immobility in our society are actually deepening and widening as a consequence of the pandemic. The format for today is that Dr. Ashley is going to summarise her research for about 15 minutes or so, and we'll have a Q&A session after that. Do think as we go through of the questions you'd like to ask and put them in there's a block thing at the bottom of your screen for Q's and A's, and I'll attempt to coordinate that and get as many answered as possible in the time that we have. And after that, Jane Welsh, who is also a co-founder of the Diversity Project and the Diversity Project charity, is going to host a panel discussion about the work that a number of the firms involved have done to actually make a practical difference to address some of the issues raised. We're also very pleased to welcome Sarah Atkinson, who is the CEO of the Social Mobility Foundation. And it was the Social Mobility Foundation who helped develop this project along with Jane Welsh and Dr. Ashley. But before I hand over, I need to tell you, you can make a donation to the charity. There's a link, or there should be a link any second, in the chat panel at the side of the Zoom screen. we're going to put it up there, and you can use it. It should be okay. And we've also putting up a link to the charity's website if you want to see more about what we've done. But that's really all from me at this point. That's, I hope, a brief introduction, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ashley to take us forward. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay, I'll assume that you'll signal to me if you can't. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here today. Just to recap on Sarah's introduction, I am an academic. I focus on diversity and inclusion in so-called elite occupations and professions, with a particular focus on socio-economic background or social class. So I look at the implementation of D&I agendas. I look at the experience of people seeking to access elite professions and then progress their career. And in addition to my academic research, I also do more policy related projects, including on my own, but also with the Bridge Group, who I will mention again in a minute. And I also evaluate programs designed to open access to these occupations. So that's a bit of background about me. Still getting used to this kind of slightly odd way of presenting to a screen, and hoping that my cat doesn't join us at any point. So hopefully we'll manage. What I'm going to do today is very briefly present the findings from the project that I conducted earlier this year, which was looking at socio-economic diversity in the investment and savings sector. And I'm going to do that hopefully in about 15 minutes, hopefully leaving time for lots of questions and the panel discussion. So before I go any further, I will just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about issues around access and then progression, and then I'll move on to recommendations for change. Before I do any of that, just to reiterate again that of course this study was funded by the Diversity Project charity via a grant provided to the SMF. This was a qualitative study. I conducted about 50 or almost 50 in-depth interviews with early career professionals and more experienced professionals working in the sector. And most of those worked at one of the 4 firms listed here, and some were reached with the help of Investment 2020. So I do want to start by extending my thanks to all those organisations and to the participants for their help and their time in agreeing to be interviewed, and of course to the Diversity Project charity for the grant. I would just add here that the focus of my interviews, the focus of the study, was not necessarily on specific organisational cultures. Interviewees were very much asked to reflect on the challenges associated with SEB across the sector, and therefore the findings should very much be seen in that context or in that light. So in essence, I was interested in discovering the barriers to entry and progression in the investment and savings sector, and that's what I'll talk about today. Before I go any further, it's probably useful just to provide some statistics on this that kind of sit behind this topic. We haven't always had great data on this. That is starting to change. So the data has been particularly looking at the organisational level. As I said, more organisations are now starting to collect data on the socio-economic background of their staff. People who are interested might want to look out for a study released by the Bridge Group in a couple of weeks, which will provide more quantitative data on what patterns look like within organisations, although that one looks across the financial services sector. If we look at the data that is currently available, one of the most useful is a study commissioned by the Sutton Group and conducted by the Boston Consulting Group back in 2014. That found that across financial services as a whole, there is this kind of quite strong bias towards people who've been privately educated. They are significantly overrepresented compared to the population at large. And this becomes particularly pronounced in certain sectors. So in hedge funds and asset management funds, for example, over 60% of leaders who've been educated in the UK had been educated privately, and that compares to about 7% of the population as a whole. More recently than that, a study by the Diversity Project found that just under 40% of investment managers were privately educated, and New Financial conducted a study of portfolio managers that found that about 2/3 went to private schools. Now, one of the striking points about all this data is that in some senses there's been really quite limited change over time. And what we see is that many of the most prestigious, perhaps the most highly remunerated jobs seem to some extent reserved for the children of the affluent, middle or upper class. Now I'm going to come on to discuss what my research says about why that's happened. I just want to touch briefly on why that might matter. There's a number of reasons here. I'm an academic, so I always want to qualify and add nuance to this, but I probably haven't got time, so I'll cover it as quickly as I can. One of the reasons this matters is it relates to social mobility. So governments in the UK over the past 10 years or so have really expressed concern about this because professional and managerial jobs have historically offered opportunities for what we call individual upward social mobility projects. Now, the suggestion from government tends to be that those opportunities have gone down and that as a result we've seen lower rates of social mobility, and that suggests that we have a less fluid, a less meritocratic society. In reality, this is quite complex, so we can make a distinction between absolute and relative social mobility. So you bear with me for a minute. Absolute social mobility measures the percentage of people who have higher incomes than their parents or who are in higher status occupations. Relative social mobility refers to how likely children are to move from their parents' place in the social hierarchy. Now, what seems to have happened is that absolute social mobility went up in the decades following World War II, and that was facilitated by an absolute expansion in professional and managerial jobs. But rates of relative social mobility have always been quite low. Now, one of the nuances which is quite important in terms of what we're talking about today is actually there is relative fluidity towards the middle of that hierarchy, but your chances of social mobility if you're at the very bottom of the income distribution are very low. Meanwhile, a kind of more privileged elite have a very tight hold on jobs and rewards at the very top of society. So we see very little movement at the top and the bottom. Now that might sound like a small detail, but it is quite important because it relates to the employment patterns that we see in your sector and others, and perhaps we'll come back to that. For now, we can work on the basis there was a period around the 60s and 70s when access to professional jobs opened up, but over the last 30 years, they then closed down essentially. Also important is issues of fairness and public trust. So it's possible that if processes are seen to be unfair, organisations may lose legitimacy. I think COVID might have some really interesting implications here because that has encouraged discussion of how jobs are valued, why they deserve particular rewards, and again, we might come back to that. And then, of course, there's the business case that will be familiar to all of us. One of the themes in my talk today is that while there is undoubtedly a business case for change, and we should use it, there are also plenty of pressures in favour of the status quo. And those might undermine the efficacy of a business case for change. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that so we know how to respond. So we can get onto the barriers now, thinking about barriers to entry and what my research said about that, and then career progression. So in other words, why do we see those kind of patterns of inclusion that I started with at the beginning of my talk? So I'll run through this quite quickly. It's a very brief overview. And some of the factors that came up in your sector are familiar from many other sectors too, and probably also with many of you. So one of the first issues here is that firms within the sector tend to recruit from so-called elite universities, often within the Russell Group. Students in those universities tend to be predominantly from more affluent backgrounds, and so that narrows diversity on entry straight away. That's especially the case for client-facing and revenue-generating roles, it seems. That's then exacerbated because in interviews, there is still a tendency, my interviewee said, for hiring managers to seek polish rather than potential, and also to really prioritise issues around cultural fit. And I will come back to that in a minute. And one of the really striking features about your sector in investment and savings is there seem to be what we call considerable sorting effects. So we seem to see this different demographic profile between, say, client-facing roles and professional support. And that can be explained at least in part because aspirant professionals appear to sort themselves into those roles on the basis of perceived fit and then are sorted by hiring managers and organisations as well. And to some extent, that seems to be quite naturalised within your sector, quite taken for granted. I would just say on that issue of naturalness, the kind of assumption that this seems to be the right thing to do, if we think about the tendency to focus on elite universities, there is no doubt that that does offer firms many good, sometimes great candidates, of course. But we have to remember that's not the only place that they can be found. Many well-qualified students attend universities outside the Russell Group. Because of our highly stratified education system, performance at A-level is not entirely tied to ability. It often strongly reflects your background, your relative privilege. So recruiting in that way shouldn't be assumed, because it does tend to exclude some very talented people. It is, on the other hand, a very good way to handle a large volume of potentially qualified candidates. It's considered a very good way to manage perceptions of organisational and individual risk. And as firms have become more concerned with status and rank, it also helps with image. And those are some of the reasons why it tends to persist. So if we just look at this quote here, some of those themes are summarised. So the idea that there's a tendency for hiring managers to recruit the kind of people who've been recruited before, because that does reduce risk. And then also hiring from elite universities helps to cement issues around image, so portray the right image to the outside world. And of course, that excludes talent. It may lead to homogeneity overall. So just moving on to progression, many of the same issues apply here, basically, just a little bit differently perhaps. So some of the processes that I've described at appointment play out through performance and promotion. So if we recruit from a narrow set of backgrounds, that is likely to work through into more senior positions. You will be familiar with the tendency of managers to recruit and promote in their own image. This may be encouraged by perceptions of what clients expect to see. So people might be recruiting the kind of person they think clients want in front of them. Networks and sponsorship play a really important role. And also confidence is really important. So confidence is very highly valued in the kind of client-facing revenue generating roles particularly. And the perception was this is more likely to be displayed by individuals from more privileged backgrounds. It's really important to say that's not necessarily because they are more confident, but because confidence is contextual. And so you're much more likely to feel confident when you're surrounded by people who are quite like you. And that offers certain people particular advantages. So, as I said, that is a very speedy run through of some of the key findings from the project. Just a couple of final slides just to kind of talk through some of the more kind of perhaps controversial, more difficult issues here. One of the key questions when we see figures and research like this is how we can change and what may encourage us to do so. I just want to return to the business case here, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And I'm going to slightly undermine our use of the business case as the thing that's most likely to drive change. Again, not saying there is no business case or that we shouldn't use it, but I want to point to some logical inconsistencies in how this works. So to understand that, we need to think about the concept of merit. So merit is very important to financial service cultures. It's important to think to how we think that organisations should run. So the fundamental idea is that organisations should implement formal rules which reward effort and ability based on objective measures of talent. Now that idea originates over a century ago. It's deeply embedded in how we think about how we should do things so that we match the right people to the right jobs in a way that's also fair. The difficulty with it is it hasn't really happened. And that's because neutral, objective labour markets don't really exist. They never really have. So when we decide who gets what job, a great deal of other factors matter. So power and interest matter, culture matters, and tradition matters a great deal. So I've hinted about cultural fit. What we know in your sector and others is that who got certain jobs in the past tends to heavily influence the kind of people we think should get them today. Now that really matters because in the diversity agenda, we have turned to the business case to change. And that also suggests that once managers are convinced that exclusion is inefficient and irrational, they will be compelled to act. But we know already that's not really how things work. So in essence, we're using a logic that we know is flawed and hoping that it will drive change, when all the evidence suggests that it can only do a small amount of change there. So again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use the business case at all, but I would say that the issues that I raise in this research are deeply entrenched. They really are. And so we might need at least to consider the requirement for other, maybe stronger levers to generate change alongside the business case. And again, maybe we can come back to that in the questions. So absolutely finally, some practical recommendations, and very quickly, this is an incredibly brief summary. One of them, of course, is to widen access, to recruit from a wider range of unis or universities, use techniques such as contextual recruitment, CV blind, but critically check that they have the effect that you hope they do, a progressive effect. Have discussions and challenge those assumptions around who fits where, denaturalize them, if you like. That might require collaboration with clients, but again, this is particularly challenging unless we have a very clear motivation for change. And as I say, we might need to think about how we use the business case in that context. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much for listening to me. I'll hand back the screen.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise. It is a challenge to us, this, and we have to look at ourselves in a number of lenses. Now, I've had, I think, one question coming through. Oh, no, perhaps not. Perhaps it's withdrawn. So maybe I can start a few questions. There's that link between that you point out between credibility and class. Are we the only group of people who have this, or is this a UK specific challenge, or is it a wider challenge?
That for me, Sarah?
Yeah,
yeah. So. No, so definitely not the only sector to have it. So it's very common, particularly in sort of what we might call knowledge intensive industries and professions. So the idea that your class, your what we call cultural capital, which I'm sure is a term that many of you are very familiar with, your kind of embodied characteristics, the idea that that would work as a proxy for quality, a proxy for expertise, is very common across many, particularly knowledge-based sectors and industries. So we would particularly also think that class would matter the most where the knowledge is most subjective, most ambiguous. The more technical and objective your work, we would expect class to matter less as that signal for expertise, for quality. So there's nothing unique about your sector in that sense. And probably nationally, also not unique, but the way in which social class plays out in different national contexts is of course quite different, because our approach to class here in the UK is rather unique, shall we say. So it is replicated, but in different ways.
And somebody's just asked a question which is sort of related to that, and I think picks up your point very well, that there are differences in the social mobility agenda from country to country.
Yeah.
You know, again, I think you made this point at that wonderful talk you gave at the Project Mosaic launch.
Yes.
You know, we go for the business case, other countries go for other approaches, and that may be more successful.
Yeah, so that's that's a really interesting, and it's a brilliant question. So I think I've mentioned before to you, Sarah, and I often do in these kind of conversations, that, and I'll try and make this point as clearly and quickly as I can. In the UK, when we talk about equality and diversity, well, put it another way, we tend to talk less about equality now than we used to, and we tend to use diversity as the kind of language that we use. Now, to some extent, that is understood by critics of the agenda as associated with this depoliticisation. So the idea here would be that when we're talking about diversity, we are talking about equality. When we're talking about equality, we're talking about who has power and whether they're prepared to share it. And if you're talking about power, by definition, you're talking about politics. You simply can't not be. So when we apply that to diversity agenda, when we talk about diversity, we are already always talking about politics. even if it masquerades as politically neutral. So I hope everyone's with me there. Now, if I take that a step further, that would then be completely matching the particular politics we have had in this country over the past 10, 15, 20 years, which essentially is a kind of neoliberal model, which is very closely associated with the idea of merit. So the idea that you award jobs on the basis of merit, and that is therefore you're ensuring that inequalities will continue, but that they will be justified, because they'll be justified in relation to talent and skill. For critics, the problem with that is that it doesn't eradicate inequalities, it simply justifies and legitimates them. So what I'm getting to is that all fits within our political model, but other countries have different politics, they practice a different sort of capitalism, and therefore their approach to social mobility will be different too.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating topic. I've also been asked, is there a correlation between gender and ethnic backgrounds and lack of social mobility?
Yes, so I think that question is asking about intersections between between gender, ethnicity, and social background. And yes, so intersections are incredibly important, and I do touch on them in my report, although I don't go into them in detail. But we do know that those characteristics intersect. They don't always, the result of those intersections don't always play out in ways that we might expect, so it's complicated. And there's a lot to be said about that, and a lot more that we need to know. But if we look at research that's been conducted, for example, by the Bridge Group, who I also do some work with, what that tends to suggest is that social class trumps everything. So social class in many contexts is more important even than gender or ethnicity. So it's absolutely critical that we should approach it and address it.
Okay, I think we haven't got any more questions coming through, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions arising from Jane's panel discussion as well. So I know you're staying with us. So perhaps, Jane, can I mean, thank you very much. I do think there are the questions of how deeply some of this is entrenched and how much some concepts we think are sort of set in stone are actually sort of, I'm going to mix a metaphor, sort of rather more set in jelly. And, you know, we kid ourselves on occasion about some of this. I think is something we can all think about, and how some of this is affected by the pandemic as well, which is throwing a number of things up in the air to be painfully obvious, I think. So, Jane, can I now hand over to you and the panel? Can you unmute yourselves, please? And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah. So I would like to introduce the panel this afternoon. So in addition to Dr. Ashley, we have Sarah Kaiser from Fidelity. She is Head of Employee Experience at Fidelity. We have Faye Farrant from Schroders. She's Head of Talent. We have Sarah Atkinson, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Social Mobility Foundation. And we have a man, we have Mark Calnan, who is a former colleague of mine and the head of investments for EMEA for Willis Towers Watson. So welcome everybody to the panel, and thanks to all of you for contributing to the research. So I'd like to start with Faye, because one of the things that came out in the research was around our recruitment processes in our industry and how they may unintentionally be leading to the lack of social mobility. So perhaps, Faye, you could perhaps touch on that and what companies can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Louise has already mentioned, it's a lot about removing the barriers that we've kind of put in our processes in the past. And she mentioned a few things already. So things like not going just to the top tier Russell universities. So having a much more open process around where you accept applications from can make a big difference. implementing the contextual tool. So giving a fairer reflection of academic achievement is really important. So we use that in our process. That's whereby people can give a little bit more information around their location, the schools that they've attended, and attach that to their application, and that can be taken into account. I think there's a big piece around our hiring managers and the attitudes they might take, or the biases that might happen in the process. And so we've seen real success in trying to remove some of that bias by creating a more objective application process. So, you know, whether that's an online assessment so that hiring managers receive objective results around how people do around things like situational judgment, logical reasoning, and really kind of opening up so that people can perform at their best, as opposed to, you know, a hiring manager just seeing someone and picking someone in their own light. So those are some of the things that we have seen have given us great results so far in providing a more objective view.
Thank you very much for that, Faye. If I could now turn to Sarah, because one of the other issues that was raised in the research was about the lack of focus on social mobility within organisations. And yes, as we heard from Dr. Ashley, you know, it's a critical underpinning of all the other aspects of diversity. So perhaps you talk a little bit about how organisations could increase their focus on this.
Sure, I understand where this comes from. So I think organisations feel there's so much they want to do around diversity and inclusion. And it's really common for people to think, I'll start with one thing, and then when I've ticked that box, I'll move on to the next. The reality is we're never going to finish the job on any aspect of D&I. And as Louise already mentioned earlier with intersectionality, we really believe that we want to create an experience at Fidelity where everyone can access careers, where we can spot and nurture great talent, and where everyone can thrive and feel like they belong, no matter who they are. And if there's a barrier to people from any background doing that, whether it's social mobility, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's gender, whether it's your sexual orientation, then we need to be addressing that. And actually, we think that by doing that and taking that wider approach to diversity and inclusion, we are able to move more quickly and in a more lasting way, and to engage our people more effectively. For social mobility, this is a newer area for us, but what we're trying to do is to bring the same focus to it by using the framework we found to be successful with other aspects of diversity. So we try to make sure that data underpins our approach and what we're doing. We've started to monitor the social backgrounds of our workforce. We've looked at how that impacts on people's feelings of inclusion. And we also bring it into our early careers strategy when thinking about where to focus. We have an executive sponsors and leads for our social mobility strand to ensure that we have that drive from the top. And one of the executive sponsors is on the call today, and they're fantastic in helping us address some of those practices that have been around for ages, that no one really knows why you do them, but they can get in the way of things like this. And we also make sure that we're listening to and engaging our employees through the grassroots. So we also have a social mobility network now of people who come from all different social backgrounds, sharing their stories to show people that there are lots of role models internally, and really championing this cause. I think by having that grassroots and leadership together and using data to drive the right decisions, you can get a much sharper focus on this in an organisation and really know what it is you want to achieve and if you've succeeded.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Perhaps I could turn to Mark now, and perhaps Mark, you could share your own personal story of joining the industry, and perhaps pick up on this issue of the kind of sorting effects that the research highlighted.
Of course, and firstly, thank you to everyone involved in this. I think it's wonderful that we're elevating this very important topic. Because as the research highlights, there's probably been an underrepresentation of this topic in some of the research today. So the first thing I'd say, Jane, and you'll remember when I entered the industry back in 2004, I did that from a background that my mum was from the Caribbean, my dad was from Southeast London. I was brought up in and around South East London, which meant I spoke in a certain way. And interestingly, in the first year or so of my existence in the working world, I was referred to as a Cockney, a wide boy, a barrow boy, none of which I took in a negative way. Others might have done, and it was certainly not meant to be delivered like that by my colleagues. But there were two reactions that I had to that. One was really a sense of irony. As a for my sins being a Millwall supporter, we talk a lot about sense of belonging. I would worry about my sense of belonging on the Millwall, watching Millwall, because I spoke better than most of the people around me. So there was a sense of irony that as I came from the world that I was used to into the working world, it was literally a polar opposite reaction to the same thing, which is how I spoke. And I noticed that there was one question around accent in the Q&A, which I'm sure we'll come to later. So first reaction was one of irony. The second reaction, honestly, was I changed my accent. I didn't necessarily mean to as proactively as I have, so some of it would have been subconscious, but ultimately I changed my accent. And that, you know, as I reflect on being a member of the industry now, 16 years later, that's pretty unsatisfactory. If people are entering our industry and we're trying to provoke this feeling of being able to bring their full selves to work, and they are either directly or inadvertently forced to change elements of who they are, we've got work to do. Now, that I think is one observation that I'd make. I think the industry has come on leaps and bounds in certain areas around that, but I think it was worth raising in the context of the question, particularly that was raised in the chat around accent.
And the sorting effects, the sort of idea that people are sort of self-selecting but also being sorted by organisations depending on their background. Do you see that?
For sure. So I think, you know, I saw it in a personal context. I'm sure we all do, but actually in the work environment, I think the industry needs to solve for a few different things. At entry level, and the research draws this out, the idea of exposure and access for people in their formative years, further down the socioeconomic ladder, to have access and understand what our industry does, needs to be proactively worked on by the industry. It's not going to happen naturally. I mentor some kids in the local area. They know nothing about the investment industry. There's nothing in their day-to-day existence, their home environment, or teachers in their careers office that is going to bring up investment as a potential opportunity for them. So we have to work on access and exposure at the entry level, and that's all the way down. So I think that goes down to financial education, but obviously also as people get older, the concept of internships to allow people to access our industry. So 100 black interns is, whilst it's about ethnicity rather than socioeconomics, there is that link that Louise talked about earlier that I think is really crucial. Those types of initiatives I think the industry needs to do more of, because lots of the stuff in Louise's research, I'm almost embarrassed to say, I recognise as it relates to our organisation and the broader industry. So there's work to do there, particularly I think at the entry level. At the later stages of people's career, I think role models is really important. You know, the idea for somebody, again, back to this sense of belonging, for somebody to see people that look and feel and sound like them in positions of power, creates an aspiration and a role model for people to work towards as well.
Thank you for that, Mark. Louise, you're on mute. I was going to ask you about the sort of concept of social capital. It sort of links to some of the comments that Mark was making. Could you maybe say a little bit about how organisations could think about helping with social capital?
Yeah, so social capital relates more to your kind of networks and friends and family that can help you to develop both the information and the knowledge to get into organisations, to understand what jobs are out there, what entry routes look like in, and may also then facilitate your career, often in slightly indirect ways once you're in. by kind of giving you that background knowledge and giving you that kind of sponsorship and support. So it's incredibly important. I mean, to some extent, in terms of access, I probably would defer to Sarah Atkinson on this one, because so much of what the SMF does is about helping to build student social capital on their behalf to help them in to these kind of organisations. But it does remain important once people are in a career as well. So I do think that things like sponsorship, mentoring, that kind of thing is really critical. And just the very fact of realising and recognising and being open about the fact that this does continue to play a role, that these things aren't entirely meritocratic and objective in the sense that we might want them to be.
Thank you for that. And so now maybe Sarah Atkinson, there's a plethora of Sarahs. You get to see what's happening across different industries and across different organisations. And it would be lovely to hear whether you think there are other organisations, other industries that are doing a better job in this area, and what we could learn from them.
Of course, thank you, Jane. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that, as Louise said in her presentation, the kind of range of issues she's identified are far from unique to this industry. Many industries are grappling with a similar pattern. And I think it's fair to say across the piece, from what we see with our work with employers and the Employers Index, that recruitment, outreach, attraction, there are some industries and some individual firms that are doing some great work here. When it comes to progression and senior leadership, that's the most difficult area right across the piece. It's typically the lowest scoring area when we mark employers on the index. So that is the hardest and most complex nut to crack. And some of the things Louise has identified give a flavour about why that's so tough to crack. There were a couple of examples I was going to share. I mean, there are lots of case studies in our Employer Index report, and I'd encourage people who are interested to take a look at that. There's a really nice example from the real estate industry, from JLL, in terms of recruitment and support. I think someone in the chat asked about how you look at sort of potential and not just polish. And one of the things that JLL do, they invest quite a lot of time in this in their recruitment process. They hold workshops for candidates from a low socioeconomic background before the recruitment process starts, to explain to them and to support them in understanding what the recruitment process is like, what it looks like, what's going to happen, what the tests are, sort of helping and coaching people to prepare themselves and supporting them through. And they also hold summer schools for unsuccessful candidates from low socioeconomic backgrounds, so that more than just individual feedback, they can actually do group work with candidates to share the things where people lost out, to enable them to improve, but also to enable JLL to take a second look at the pool of candidates they're screening out, and themselves do some reflection on, why are we screening these people out? Actually, have we made the right decisions here? Are we happy with what our process is doing in terms of our hires? I think some of the work that the accountancy profession have done around this together as a sector, they've set up a scheme called Access Accountancy, which has lots of the big accountants in it, working together as an industry, sharing information and access on pipelines, on recruitment, on attraction. That group conversation also works both for mutual support and confidence, plus a bit of sort of chivvying and challenge when firms are finding things difficult to up the practice. And I think some of the things that PwC, who've topped our index last year, have done within the accountancy profession on that senior level work, and I would stress, and PwC would stress, they have not cracked this, but they are kind of focusing at this end on things like analysing the class pay gap that exists in PwC, looking at the data on who's earning the most money and what the factors are that drive that. Senior level championship, so that it's culturally in PwC important to be part of the social mobility conversation, to be championing social mobility. And I think the third thing, picking up on what Louise was just talking about in terms of mentors and sponsorship and how important that is. We work with a lot of firms who think at first about mentoring as something that they will give to people from a low socioeconomic background as a one-way traffic. And certainly the contribution, the advice of a mentor and the knowledge and the contribution that that builds in terms of a network is hugely valuable to our young people. But we also see that it's influential within those firms. The individuals who are mentors and champions of social mobility become champions within their firms because they spend time with our young people, and they go back to the firm and say, as we don't have to think about this as a philanthropic endeavour to help people. These guys are great. We need them in the firm. They're really talented. They're really clever. They're really ambitious. We need to get them in. And so that can be transformative, not just for the young people, but back into the firm to build that championing and that driving. So that's a really helpful initiative and endeavour I would encourage you to have a look at.
That's fantastic advice there. We've had a few questions in from the attendees. One is around how, and maybe moving away from kind of entry level, but to more what happens within organisations. And the question was around how do we ensure that our promotion processes allow for authenticity and allow for differences in polish or whatever. So I just wonder if anyone wants to take that up. How do we, I suppose, address some of the issues that Mark talked about with, you know, in terms of, you know, judging people by their accent and so on. Is anyone willing to sort of have a go at that one?
I can give a quick academic perspective and probably then pass over to somebody else to take it perhaps in a more practical direction, if that would help. I don't know. I would just say here that it's incredibly difficult. So I think it's fair to say that firms on average organisations have made more progress in opening access and doing stuff at that level than they have, I think, as Sarah Atkinson just mentioned, in driving significant change in relation to career progression. One of the things I suppose academics talk about in this context is going back to this issue of merit. One of the things that we know in professional jobs, what we might call elite jobs, whatever we want to call them, is that imposing objectivity is extraordinarily difficult. And one of the, so we can sometimes call it the ideal of impartiality. And one of the reasons it's extraordinarily difficult is because this kind of work is hugely ambiguous. It's very difficult to judge who's doing what job. Sometimes we don't even know what other people are doing in their job. And we also know that it rests on social relations, and trust is all incredibly important in these kind of roles. We can't kind of wish that away. It's a fact of professional life, but those kind of things massively get in the way of objectivity as people are being promoted, because people will promote to reduce their own sense of risk, essentially, in that context. So I think the first thing we have to do is kind of accept that, acknowledge that that is a reality, and then think what we do. And again, one of the things that I would say again is to denaturalize those kind of ideas that have become deeply embedded around who fits where. Now, most of those ideas go right back, and I'm writing a book about this, so I'm particularly interested, they go right back to the kind of the 60s, or even before the 60s, the first half of the last century, when kind of who did what job in the city got quite firmly established. And we still have quite set ideas based on that as to who goes in what role. So I do think that one of the things we can do is to work harder to challenge those deeply embedded assumptions of fit. And I'd even say that when we look at the kind of private education bias within financial services and elsewhere, we're kind of a bit shocked by it, but we're not remotely surprised in some ways. And that is part of the naturalization, because really it should be quite shocking, if you're with me. So I think denaturalizing that is really important, but I'll hand over to somebody else on that one.
Well, I was actually going to build on that, and because we've got another question in here about the role that investors could play in challenging the need for somebody to be super confident or super polished to be in a client-facing role. And Mark, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, happy, if I may, just firstly to Louise's point, which I think is absolutely spot on. You know, this concept of just allowing things to happen organically and expecting a different outcome, it doesn't work. So we've actually literally in the last month been going through this process internally. And when we look at what we call promotion readiness, if you take away all of the extra work that we need to do around it, that outcome points to a reinforcement of the biases that we know exist in our organisation and the industry. So what we've done, and as I said, we've done this very recently, but we did it last year as well, is what's called a talent review, which is where we go through individuals at certain levels where we know that there are issues around it, particularly through this I&D lens, and we go and change the outcome. And whilst you could look at that from the outside and say that's not fair, the way that we see it is actually you are levelling the playing field, whether it's on gender or ethnicity or socioeconomic background. All of those things we recognise because of research not only that Louise has done but that we've all read, that if you don't level the playing field, then it's going to be an unfair advantage to the privileged. So, but we had to, it's quite a difficult thing for us to work out that actually having good people around that are fair and generally a positive culture, surely they'll work it out themselves. The answer is that they won't, because of all of those inherent biases that Louise talked to. So that's something that we've done specifically around people. But to your point, Jane, it needs to come from clients and investors for it to work more widespread, because it's no good for the asset managers or investment organisations like ours, fiduciary managers, consultants, to do it, but then ultimately our clients like it because the people that we promote don't have the right accent or look the right way or wear the right clothes. Ultimately, it needs to work through that chain, because the organisations that make those changes, if the investors vote with their feet, then there's going to be a sustainability challenge. So we absolutely need to have that, frankly, uncomfortable conversation with investors to the extent that they're not already thinking like this. However, I think there's been a lot of progress around how investors are thinking through this, even in our own organisation with our research hats on. We are very focused on the I&D angle, and any of the asset managers on the panel now will be aware that that's a key area of focus when it comes to us identifying who we want our clients' capital to invest with. But I think everybody needs to take on that uncomfortable conversation with their clients and investors and challenge where it makes sense to, if we want this to be a really widespread industry-wide impact.
I just like a sort of a personal story around that is that I think we sometimes make assumptions about what our clients want, and Sarah's nodding wildly. So I nearly didn't get my second job, which wasn't Willis Towers Watson, because somebody on the interview panel said, I don't think clients will like that Yorkshire accent. I did, like Mark, my Yorkshire accent has sort of disappeared over the years as I've sort of acclimatized to the city. But actually, I think the Yorkshire accent worked really well with many of the clients, particularly those who weren't based in London. I think it enabled me to make relationships with clients in a different way. So I think we sometimes make assumptions that clients are looking for polish and that sort of overconfidence that perhaps isn't the case.
Agreed, entirely.
I'm just wondering if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I don't think we have. Apologies if we've missed some. I'd quite like to just quickly go round the panel and just, if they could quite quickly say one thing they're taking away from the report that they're going to take action on. So perhaps starting with Faye.
Yeah, I was very much taken by this idea of sorting effect that happens through the hiring process. So there's an assumption around where people should turn up, and I guess we try and take the kind of view that people are a cultural add rather than a cultural fit, and kind of change the way people are thinking. But I just definitely want to think about how we stop that happening. It's very there's a lot of ambiguity in that, isn't there? But I think actually being very purposeful about pushing it the other way would probably be the way to go.
Thank you. And Sarah Kayser?
One thing that really struck me about the report was that while we often talk about early careers, was realizing that there are still so many challenges and biases and barriers for people from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds who are already in the organisation, and especially the bit of the report that said they don't always see that, so they feel they've had a fair opportunity, even though the things they describe don't always show that. So that's why it's really important for me that we're working with colleagues to understand their experiences, to improve them and to share their stories. Something that we've really heard is that it can be quite hard for people to recognise where people might come from different or unusual backgrounds in our workforce, because they've worked so hard to fit in with the majority. And what I'd really like to do is make sure that people feel they can succeed while remaining true to who they are in Fidelity. And I was very much inspired by this. So thank you, Louise, and everyone involved for doing this research. It's really helped us to focus more.
And Mark, is there something that you're going to sort of take away from this report?
Yeah, for sure. Just reinforcing that the last bit in Louise's slides, the headline, "The motivation for change is currently not clear." I mean, given the context of the research and the conversation we've just had, it absolutely should be. So doing what we can as an organisation, both in the way that we research asset managers, but also the way that we talk to people about our own purpose. We've started to talk about 5 stakeholders, not just shareholders and clients and colleagues, but also society and planet. This fits into the societal angle as well as colleagues, reinforcing that so that it has more of a cultural change through both our own organisation and via our research efforts. The investment industry more broadly is what we're going to try and do as a result, Jane.
Thank you. And Sarah Atkinson, is there sort of something that you would like, you'd hope the industry picks up on from this work and does differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reflections across the piece of how critical this is, I think, as Sarah Kay just said, how much of a barrier and how much of a burden people from low socioeconomic backgrounds can have to carry in getting into the industry and getting on in the industry, and kind of recognising and talking about that, and that conversation is really important. I hope there are things that organisations like mine can do to support, because we always try to be incredibly positive about this. You know, it is important that you take the first step. We then want you to take more and more and more steps, but it is really important that you take this on. And I think, you know, I've found myself, I always find it useful listening to these conversations, and certainly the point Louise made about the business case not necessarily being enough. You know, this isn't just about logicking people into thinking that the maths of this makes sense. This is actually a sort of societal responsibility and a human issue, and remembering that we always need to be having the conversation with you on all of those levels to help you to take this problem on, I think is a good reminder for me and for organisations like mine.
Well, in the interest of time, I won't move to Louise, but I will just say to thank you so much to all of you for both your involvement in the research, but also for taking part in the panel session this afternoon. It's been great to hear all the great work that's being done, but there's a lot more to do, which is really to Sarah A's point. So I'd now like to hand back to Sarah B to wrap up. So thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And another, to Louise's point about our concepts that we think are sort of somehow objective, another set of concepts that are fairly dodgy, and I know Sarah A's had a bit of a run-in with this, is the concept of leadership and CEO, and that links in with the bit about pulling people through and giving people a lift up. You know, we have to be much clearer about the evidence base for what is good leadership. And maybe the current strange environment again is throwing up some interesting different ways of behaviour and admiration for different sorts of skills. So I do hope, but I think our concepts of leadership need a bit of a thinking through. Actually, we have a few stereotypes there which help entrench some of the things going on elsewhere. But anyway, thank you all very much indeed. The fantastic discussion. Thank you for the questions coming in, and I'm having a number of sort of getting the odd text as well. So there's a lot to be done. As I said, we will be sending out the summary report and emails to all attendees. And you know, do get back in touch with us via the charity website if you'd like to. Thank you very much indeed. That was great. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.